The snow fell in thick curtains across New Geneva colony, each flake catching the amber glow of the settlement's protective energy barriers. Marcus Chun adjusted his tool belt and glanced at the chronometer embedded in his workshop wall. 2,300 hours on Christmas Eve, and still no sign of his final customer. The workshop smelled of wood shavings and metal polish, a comforting combination that reminded him of his grandfather's carpentry shop back on Earth. But this wasn't Earth, and his customers weren't always human. The Galactic Accord had opened trade routes between dozens of species, and Marcus had discovered that the universal need for skilled craftsmanship transcended biological differences. His comm unit buzzed with a message from his daughter Sarah, safe in their apartment above the shop. "Dad, you should close up. It's Christmas Eve, and whoever it is can wait until after the holiday." Marcus smiled at the display showing Sarah's concerned face. At 17, she was wise beyond her years, having grown up in the frontier colonies where survival often depended on practicality over sentiment. But tonight felt different. Something in the urgency of the original commission request had touched something deep in his craftsman's soul. The order had come through 3 weeks ago, transmitted from a ship still in the outer system. The species identifier marked it as Draconian, one of the proud reptilian races known for their advanced technology and fierce independence. What struck Marcus as unusual wasn't the species, but the personal nature of the request. Most Draconian orders were for utilitarian items or sophisticated technological components. This request was different. The customer wanted a child's bed, handcrafted from real wood, with specific dimensional requirements that suggested a young Draconian of perhaps 8 to 10 standard years. The accompanying message had been brief, but carried an undertone of desperation that transcended language barriers. Marcus had thrown himself into the project with unprecedented passion. He'd selected the finest Terran oak from his carefully hoarded supply, wood that had cost him a month's earnings to import from Earth. Each joint was cut by hand, each surface sanded to silk smoothness. The headboard featured an intricate carving of stars and nebulae, a cosmic lullaby rendered in wood grain. The bed was a masterpiece, possibly the finest work of his career. It sat now in the center of his workshop, covered by a protective cloth, waiting for its owner. Another hour passed. Marcus busied himself organizing his tools, sweeping sawdust, and checking the environmental controls that kept his workshop at optimal temperature and humidity. The colony's artificial day cycle had shifted to night mode, dimming the overhead lighting to simulate the rhythm of a planetary rotation. At midnight, his patience was rewarded by the deep thrum of atmospheric engines cutting through the winter air. Marcus stepped outside, pulling his coat tight against the cold, and watched a sleek Draconian transport settle onto the designated landing pad adjacent to his workshop. The ship was smaller than typical Draconian vessels, a personal craft rather than a merchant hauler. Scorch marks along its hull suggested recent hard travel, possibly through hostile space. As the engines wound down and the passenger ramp extended, Marcus felt his chest tighten with anticipation. The figure that emerged from the ship was unmistakably Draconian, standing nearly 3 meters tall with the characteristic reptilian features and metallic scaled skin that shifted between deep green and bronze in the artificial light. But something was wrong. The Draconian moved with obvious exhaustion, each step careful and measured as though conserving energy. As the figure approached, Marcus realized this was a female, her scales bearing the distinctive patterns that Draconian society used to indicate maternal status. She was alone, which immediately struck Marcus as unusual. Draconians typically traveled in family units or formal diplomatic groups. Marcus chunt. Her voice carried the typical Draconian harmonic undertones, but it was strained with fatigue and something else. Worry, perhaps, or grief. "That's me. You must be Zarathes." Marcus had practiced the pronunciation, knowing that proper names held deep cultural significance for Draconians. "I apologize for the late hour. My journey was complicated." She paused, her large golden eyes scanning the workshop behind him. "Is it ready?" "It's ready." Marcus gestured toward the workshop. "Please, come in out of the cold." As they walked toward the shop, Marcus noticed that Zarathes carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but her current circumstances suggested a fall from whatever position she'd once held. Her clothing was practical rather than ornamental, designed for travel rather than ceremony. Inside the workshop, Marcus pulled away the protective covering, revealing the child's bed in all its carefully crafted glory. The wood seemed to glow under the workshop lights, each carved detail sharp and precise. Zarathes stopped breathing. For a long moment, she simply stared at the bed, her scaled hands clasped tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice carried harmonics that Marcus had never heard from a Draconian before, tones that spoke of loss and desperate hope intermingled. "It is perfect, more beautiful than I dared imagine." She reached out as though to touch the carved headboard, then pulled her hand back. "May I ask, do you have children, Marcus Chun?" "A daughter, Sarah. She's 17 now." Marcus found himself speaking more softly, sensing that this conversation was moving into territory that required delicacy. "Then you understand the lengths a parent will travel, the prices they will pay." Zarathes finally reached out and touched the bed surface, her clawed fingertips tracing the carved stars. "This is not simply furniture. This is hope made tangible." Marcus waited, sensing that there was more to this story than a simple furniture commission. In his years of working with various species, he learned that sometimes the most important part of his job had nothing to do with woodworking. "My daughter, Kessera, has been ill." The words came slowly, as though each one caused pain. "A genetic condition that affects young draconians. The medical facilities on our homeworld are no longer available to us." The implication hung in the air between them. Exile. In draconian society, exile was a fate considered worse than death, cutting an individual off not just from their physical homeland, but from the complex social networks that define their existence. "I've brought her to the medical facilities here on New Geneva Colony. The human doctors are optimistic, but the treatment will take months, possibly longer. She needs stability, comfort, a place that feels like home." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding now why this commission had felt so urgent. This wasn't just a bed. It was an anchor point, a piece of normality in a situation that must feel completely chaotic to a young draconian child. "The wood you chose," Zarathes continued, "it has a sense similar to the sleeping groves on our homeworld. When Kessera was very young, before the illness, we would take family trips to the ancient forests. She would sleep among the roots of trees older than our civilization, breathing in their wisdom." Marcus felt a deep warmth spread through his chest. Sometimes the most sophisticated manufacturing systems in the galaxy couldn't replicate the simple power of choosing the right materials with careful intention. "Where is she now?" Marcus asked. "At the medical center, in isolation until the doctors can stabilize her condition." Zarathes's voice carried a note of force control. "She has been alone for 3 days. I am permitted only limited contact until the initial treatment phase is complete." The picture was becoming clearer. A desperate mother, separated from her sick child, trying to create some small comfort in an alien environment. Marcus understood now why she'd specified Christmas Eve for delivery. Human holidays might not hold meaning for Draconians, but the symbolism of gift-giving and renewal was universal. "The payment," Zarathes began, reaching for a credit transfer device. Marcus held up a hand. "Let's talk about delivery first. You want this taken to the medical center?" "If possible." The doctors said they could permit it in her room once the initial quarantine period ends. "Tomorrow, they estimate." Marcus glanced at the chronometer. Christmas morning was only hours away. "I have a better idea. Why don't we set up tonight? I know someone at the medical center who might be able to help us bend a few regulations." For the first time since entering his workshop, Zarathes's expression shifted towards something that might have been hope. Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen many strange things during her 15 years at New Geneva Colony Medical Center, but a human carpenter and an exiled draconian mother standing in her office at 2 in the morning on Christmas Day still ranked among the more unusual. "Marcus, You know I can't just authorize unauthorized equipment in isolation rooms, Elena said, though her tone suggested she was already looking for ways to make it happen. She'd known Marcus since his arrival in the colony 7 years ago, had watched him build his business from nothing while raising his daughter alone. It's not equipment, it's furniture, Marcus replied. Specifically crafted therapeutic furniture designed to provide psychological comfort to a pediatric patient experiencing severe cultural displacement. Elena raised an eyebrow. Did you just make that up? Maybe, but it's also accurate. Marcus gestured toward Zarathes, who stood silently near the office window, looking out toward the medical center's main building. This mother has been separated from her sick daughter for 3 days. Tomorrow is supposed to be a celebration of hope and new beginnings for humans. Seems like a good time to extend that to our non-human neighbors. Elena studied Zarathes's reflection in the window. As head of xenobiology at the medical center, she'd worked with dozens of species, but Draconians were notoriously private about their personal lives. The fact that this one was here, alone, and clearly desperate, suggested circumstances far beyond normal medical tourism. What's the child's condition? Elena asked. Zarathes turned from the window, her golden eyes meeting Elena's with an intensity that was distinctly draconian. Kessera suffers from temporal genetic displacement syndrome. Her DNA is attempting to revert to an earlier evolutionary stage of our species. Without treatment, she will lose cognitive function and eventually die. Elena felt her breath catch. She'd read about TGDS in xenomedical journals, but had never encountered a case. It was incredibly rare, affecting perhaps 1 in 10 million draconian children, and treatment required resources available only at the most advanced medical facilities. The treatment protocol requires complete genetic reconstruction over a period of 6 to 8 months, Zarathes continued. On our homeworld, such treatment would be routine. But circumstances have made that impossible. Elena didn't press for details about those circumstances. In frontier medicine, patient privacy often extended to family political situations, especially when dealing with species known for complex social hierarchies. I've reviewed her case file, Elena said carefully. The treatment plan is aggressive, but promising. However, psychological stability during such an extended medical intervention is crucial. Familiar environmental factors could significantly improve treatment outcomes. Marcus smiled. Elena was finding her medical justification. The bed incorporates materials with olfactory properties similar to her home environment, Marcus added. It could be classified as aromatherapy equipment. Now you're just pushing it, Elena said, but she was already moving toward her terminal. However, given the unique circumstances and the potential psychological benefits to the patient, I'm willing to authorize a temporary exception to isolation protocols. Zarathes's posture straightened, hope flickering in her expression. You would do this? For a child you have never met. Elena paused in her typing. Dr. Chun, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. She looked directly at Zarathes. 3 months ago, my own daughter was in an accident. Spinal trauma, extensive reconstructive surgery, weeks of recovery in a medical isolation unit. Marcus showed up every day with small wooden toys he'd carved, each one designed to exercise specific motor functions while providing emotional comfort. Marcus looked embarrassed. Elena, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Elena's voice was firm. Those toys helped Maria recover faster than any of our medical projections suggested. Sometimes healing requires more than just medical intervention. Sometimes it requires someone caring enough to create hope out of raw materials. She turned back to her terminal, fingers flying over the controls. I'm authorizing the furniture as essential patient comfort equipment. We'll need to decontaminate it first, which will take about an hour. That gives us time to prepare the room and brief the night staff. Zarathes moved closer to Elena's desk, her movements more fluid now than the exhausted, shuffling Marcus had observed earlier. Dr. Vasquez, I'm not certain how to properly express gratitude in human terms. In human terms, you don't need to. We're neighbors. This is what neighbors do. What followed was a carefully orchestrated dance of medical protocols and creative interpretation. Marcus and Elena worked together to disassemble the bed into components that could fit through the medical center's decontamination systems. Each piece was carefully labeled and processed through sterilization chambers normally reserved for surgical equipment. While the decontamination ran its course, Elena led them through the medical center's quiet corridors toward the isolation wing. Most of the facility operated on skeleton crews during the holiday shift, which made their unusual mission easier to accomplish without attracting unwanted attention. Kesera is in room 7, Elena explained as they walked. She's been responding well to the genetic therapy, but the psychological impact of isolation has been significant. Draconian children are highly social creatures. Extended separation from family units can trigger regression behaviors. They paused outside a reinforced viewing window. Beyond the transparent barrier lay a small figure on a medical bed that seemed far too large for her diminutive frame. Kesera appeared to be perhaps 10 years old in human equivalent, though Marcus knew that draconian aging didn't correlate directly with human development. The child's scales, which should have been the vibrant green gold of healthy young draconians, had faded to a dull bronze gray. Medical monitoring devices surrounded her bed like technological sentinels, their soft beeping providing a rhythm that felt both comforting and ominous. But it was her eyes that struck Marcus most profoundly. Even through the viewing window and across the small room, he could see that Kesera's golden eyes held an awareness far beyond her apparent age. This was a child who had been forced to confront mortality in a way that no young creature should ever have to experience. "She's beautiful," Marcus said quietly. Zarathes pressed her hand against the viewing window. She was always curious about other species. Before the illness, she would spend hours reading about human customs and traditions. She was particularly fascinated by the concept of gift-giving during your winter celebrations. Elena consulted her datapad. "The decontamination cycle will be complete in 20 minutes. I'll need to prep the room for assembly." As Elena moved away to coordinate with the medical staff, Marcus found himself alone with Zarathes in the quiet corridor. The artificial night lighting cast long shadows that seemed to emphasize the emotional weight of the situation. "Marcus Chun," Zarathes said suddenly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When your daughter was young, did you ever face a situation where all your resources, all your knowledge, all your social connections were insufficient to protect her?" Marcus thought about Sarah's early years on the frontier, the constant low-level dangers of colonial life, the nights when he'd lain awake worrying about everything from equipment failures to hostile wildlife. But he never faced anything like what Zarathes was experiencing. "I've been fortunate," he said honestly, "but I think I can imagine the fear." "Fear." Zarathes repeated the word as though testing its weight. In Draconian, we have 17 different words for various types of fear. The fear of physical pain, the fear of social disgrace, the fear of technological failure. But there is no word in my language for the fear a parent feels when watching their child suffer from something beyond their power to fix. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding. "Is that why you came here, to New Geneva? Not just for the medical treatment, but because sometimes being an outsider is easier than being powerless among your own people." Zarathes looked at him with surprise. "You understand. I understand being a single parent, trying to do right by your child in circumstances you never planned for." For a moment, the species barrier dissolved entirely. They were simply two parents standing in a medical facility in the middle of the night, united by the universal experience of loving someone more than yourself and feeling helpless to protect them from the universe's indifference. Elena returned with 2 medical technicians and a loading cart. Decontamination complete. Ready to set up a bedroom. As they moved toward the isolation room, Marcus caught sight of Kesera stirring slightly in her medical bed. Even unconscious, she seemed to sense the approaching presence of her mother. The next hour would determine whether a carpenter's skill could bridge the gap between hope and healing. Working inside an isolation room while wearing full medical protective gear challenged even Marcus's considerable experience with precision assembly. The environmental suit made his movements clumsy, and the helmet's visor fogged whenever he concentrated too intensely on fitting joints together. But magic was happening nonetheless. The bed components, sterilized and gleaming under the medical facility's harsh lighting, began to transform back into furniture. Marcus had designed the joinery system to be assembled without tools, using traditional wooden pins and precisely cut interlocking pieces that would hold together through compression and friction. Elena monitored from outside the room, speaking through the comm system. Patient's vital signs are showing increased brain activity. She's becoming aware of the activity in her room. Zarathes stood at the viewing window, her hands pressed flat against the transparent barrier. She was forbidden from entering the isolation room until the medical protocols were complete, but her attention was wholly focused on her daughter. Kessera had indeed awakened. The young Draconian was sitting up in her medical bed, watching Marcus's work with intense curiosity. Despite her illness, her eyes held the bright intelligence that Zarathes had described. She seemed particularly fascinated by the hand-carved details emerging as Marcus assembled the headboard. Dr. Vasquez, Kessera said suddenly, her voice carrying the same harmonic undertones as her mother's, but pitched higher with youth and excitement. The human is building furniture. Real wood furniture. I have read about this in the cultural databases. Elena smiled behind her medical mask. That's right, Kessera. It's a gift from your mother. A gift. The concept seemed to surprise her. But it is not my hatching day. Human gift-giving customs are related to specific temporal markers. Sometimes humans give gifts just because they care about someone, Elena explained. This is called a Christmas gift. Christmas is a human celebration of hope and family. Marcus finished fitting the headboard and turned to position the bed frame properly in the room. As he did, he caught sight of Kessera watching him work, and their eyes met across the room. The moment of contact was electric. Marcus had worked with many species over the years, but there was something uniquely intense about draconian eye contact. It was as though Kessera was reading his intentions, his emotions, the very sincerity of his craftsmanship. After a long moment, she spoke directly to him. Human Marcus Chun, why did you choose the star pattern for the carving? Marcus paused in his work, considering his answer carefully. Because stars are visible from anywhere in the galaxy. No matter how far you travel from home, the same stars are shining down on everyone you love. Kessera was quiet for several minutes, processing this concept. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I cannot see the stars from this room. The walls are very thick. That's why I carved them into the headboard, Marcus replied. Now you'll have stars with you even in places where the real ones can't reach. The bed was nearly complete now. Marcus attached the side rails and tested each joint for stability. The Terran oak gleamed warmly under the medical lighting, bringing an organic presence into the sterile environment that felt almost revolutionary. As Marcus worked, he became aware of a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The medical monitoring equipment continued its soft beeping, but somehow the sound felt less mechanical, more like a lullaby. The harsh medical lighting seemed softer where it reflected off the wood surface. Elena's voice came through the comm system. Psychological readings are showing significant positive response. Heart rate is stabilizing. Stress hormones are decreasing markedly. Is that good? Zarathes asked. It's very good. Stress inhibits the genetic reconstruction process. The more relaxed and comfortable Kessera can remain during treatment, the more effectively her body can accept the genetic modifications. Marcus stepped back from the completed bed. Even in the medical room's stark environment, it was beautiful. The carved stars seemed to dance in the reflected light, and the warm wood grain provided a visual anchor that made the space feel less institutional. Kessera, Elena said over the comm, would you like to try out your new bed? The young Draconian moved carefully from her medical bed to the wooden one. Her movements were deliberate and measured, clearly affected by her illness, but her expression was one of wonder. As she settled onto the new bed, something remarkable happened. The tension that had been visible in her scaled features since Marcus's arrival began to fade. Her posture relaxed, her breathing deepened, and, for the first time, She looked like a child rather than a patient. "It smells like the sleeping groves," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "That's the Terran oak," Marcus explained. "It comes from trees that grow in forests older than human civilization. I thought you might appreciate the connection to ancient growing things." Kessera ran her clawed fingertips along the carved headboard, tracing the stellar patterns with obvious delight. "The texture is perfect. Draconians have very sensitive touch receptors. The way you sanded the wood creates exactly the right tactile feedback for comfortable rest." Marcus felt a flush of professional pride. He'd spent hours getting that surface finish precisely right, but he hadn't expected such sophisticated appreciation from someone so young. "How long must I remain in isolation?" Kessera asked Elena. "Another week, possibly two. The genetic therapy needs to achieve certain stability markers before we can allow normal contact." "But Mother is here? I can see her." "Yes, she's right outside the viewing window." Kessera turned toward the window and waved at Zarathes. The gesture was simple, but the emotion behind it was profound. Zarathes pressed both hands against the barrier and spoke in Draconian, words that carried musical tones Marcus had never heard before. Elena noticed his curious expression. "She's singing a traditional Draconian lullaby, a song mothers sing to children who are far from home." The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to resonate with something deeper than hearing. Even filtered through the comm system and the isolation barrier, it carried an emotional weight that transcended language. As the song continued, Marcus noticed that the medical monitoring equipment was recording significant changes in Kessera's physiological responses. Her heart rate was slowing to more normal ranges, brain activity patterns were shifting toward those associated with deep relaxation, and even her scale coloration seemed to be brightening slightly. Dr. Vasquez, one of the medical technicians, said quietly, "I've never seen psychological stress markers drop this rapidly during isolation treatment." Elena nodded, making notes on her datapad. The combination of familiar materials, family presence, and cultural continuity is creating an optimal healing environment. Sometimes the best medicine is simply helping patients feel less alone. Marcus began cleaning up the tools and packaging materials, preparing to leave the room. His work here was done, but he found himself reluctant to break the peaceful atmosphere that had developed. "Marcus Chin," Kessera called out as he moved toward the airlock. "When I'm no longer in isolation, may I visit your workshop? I would like to learn about human woodworking techniques." "I'd be honored to show you," Marcus replied. "Your mother mentioned you're interested in human customs. Perhaps you'd like to help me prepare for next year's Christmas season." "Yes," Kessera said decisively. "I think I would enjoy participating in human hope creation traditions." As Marcus sealed the airlock behind him and began the decontamination procedure, he could hear Zarathes continuing her lullaby. The sound followed him through the medical center's corridors like a blessing, carrying with it the knowledge that sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the galaxy couldn't compete with the simple power of a mother's love and a craftsman's care. Outside, the first light of Christmas morning was beginning to show above New Geneva Colony's protective barriers. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in his workshop putting finishing touches on a small wooden puzzle box when the shop's entry chime announced a visitor. He looked up to see Zarathes entering, but this time she wasn't alone. Kessera walked beside her mother with careful steps, still recovering from the medical treatments, but clearly much stronger than when Marcus had first seen her through the isolation room window. Her scales had regained much of their natural luster, shifting from bronze green to gold as she moved through the workshop's warm lighting. "The isolation protocols were lifted yesterday," Zarathes explained. "Kessera has been speaking of nothing but visiting your workshop since you made the invitation." Marcus set down his carving tools and smiled. "Welcome to my workshop, Kessera. How are you feeling?" "Much improved," she replied with characteristic draconian directness. "The genetic reconstruction is proceeding within acceptable parameters. Dr. Vasquez estimates full recovery within 4 more months." She paused, studying the workspace with obvious fascination. This environment is quite different from draconian manufacturing facilities. Marcus looked around his workshop, trying to see it through her eyes. Where draconian industry relied on advanced technology and precision automation, his workspace was deliberately primitive. Hand tools hung on wooden pegboards. Pieces of raw lumber were stacked according to species and grain pattern, and the scent of wood oils and metal polish created an atmosphere that spoke of individual craftsmanship rather than mass production. Most of my tools were made by humans hundreds of years ago, Marcus explained, lifting a hand plane whose wooden body had been polished smooth by generations of use. We believe there's something valuable about the connection between a craftsperson and tools that have been touched by many hands over many years. Kessera approached one of his workbenches, where several projects were in various stages of completion. Her golden eyes examined each piece with the systematic attention Marcus had learned to associate with draconian intelligence. This joining technique, she said, pointing to a dovetail joint on a small cabinet, it requires no adhesives or mechanical fasteners. That's right. The wood itself holds the joint together through compression and precise fitting. It's a technique human carpenters developed over thousands of years. Fascinating. May I touch it? Marcus nodded, and Kessera traced the intricate joint with one clawed fingertip. Her touch was incredibly light, almost reverent. On our home world, we have craftspeople who work with crystalline structures, growing them into functional forms through harmonic manipulation, she said. But this is different. You're taking something that was once alive and giving it new purpose while respecting its original nature. Marcus felt a warm surge of professional pride. Few of his customers, human or otherwise, understood the philosophical aspects of traditional woodworking. Zarathes moved closer to the workbench where her daughter stood. Kessera has been reading extensively about human cultural traditions. The concept of handmade objects as expressions of individual creativity has captured her imagination. I brought you something, Kessera said suddenly, reaching into a small bag she carried. She withdrew an object that made Marcus catch his breath. It was a carving, roughly the size of his palm, made from what appeared to be some kind of crystalline material that shifted color as it caught the light. The subject was a tree, but rendered with alien geometry that suggested growth patterns no Terran plant had ever followed. The detail work was extraordinary, with individual leaves and bark textures visible at microscopic scales. I made this during my recovery time, Kessera explained. Dr. Vasquez said creative activities would help with the psychological aspects of treatment. It is a memory tree from our home world, carved from compressed memory crystal. Marcus accepted the gift with careful hands. The crystal was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse gently with its own inner light. Kessera, this is remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. Memory crystal responds to harmonic vibration. If you hold it properly and think of a specific memory, the crystal will record the emotional resonance of that experience. She demonstrated, placing her hands around the carving in a specific pattern. When others touch it, they can sense the recorded memories. Marcus followed her example, holding the crystal tree while thinking about Christmas morning 2 weeks ago, standing in the medical isolation room watching a sick child's face light up with wonder at a simple wooden bed. The crystal grew warm, then seemed to vibrate with a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. For a moment, Marcus could have sworn he felt an echo of emotions that weren't his own. Gratitude, wonder, and something that might have been hope. This is incredible, Marcus said. Thank you, Kessera. This is one of the most beautiful gifts I've ever received. I wanted to create something that would carry forward the memory of what you did for us, she said with a serious tone that seemed characteristic of young draconians. In our culture, such gestures create permanent bonds of obligation. You don't owe me anything, Marcus said gently. Perhaps not in human terms, but in draconian understanding, you provided aid when aid was needed, with no expectation of benefit to yourself. This creates what we call a heart debt. It can only be repaid through continuing kindness to others. Zarathes smiled, an expression that transformed her reptilian features into something approaching maternal warmth. What my daughter is trying to say is that you have become family to us, Marcus Chun, in the way that humans understand family. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Since arriving on New Geneva Colony 7 years ago, he'd worked hard to build a life for himself and Sarah, but he'd always felt like an outsider among the various communities that made up the colonial settlement. "I'm honored," he said simply. "So," Kesara said with sudden enthusiasm, "will you teach me about human woodworking? I wish to learn to create objects that carry meaning across time." Marcus grinned. "I'd love to, but I should warn you, it requires a lot of patience. Human craftsmanship is much slower than draconian technology. I have learned patience recently," Kesara said with a maturity that spoke to her recent experiences. Dr. Vasquez says that healing cannot be rushed, only supported. Perhaps creation is similar. It is indeed. For the next several hours, Marcus introduced Kesara to the basics of human woodworking. She proved to be a remarkably apt student, with steady hands and an intuitive understanding of how wood grain affected cutting and shaping techniques. While they worked, Zarathes shared more of their story. The exile from their home world had been the result of political changes that made their family's position untenable. They were refugees, essentially, though draconian pride made that word difficult to speak aloud. "New Geneva Colony has been more welcoming than we dared hope," Zarathes said. "The human administrators have offered us permanent settlement status. Kesara could grow up here, attend your schools, perhaps even pursue higher education at the Colonial University. And you? What will you do?" "I have expertise in quantum harmonics and crystalline engineering." Dr. Vasquez believes there might be opportunities to work with the colony's technical staff. Marcus watched Kesara carefully shaping a small piece of pine, her tongue protruding slightly in concentration. "What about her? How does she feel about staying?" "She has adapted more readily than I anticipated. Human culture values individual achievement in ways that appeal to her personality. And she has expressed particular interest in what she calls the human gift-giving tradition." "She means Christmas?" "More broadly than that. The human concept that objects can carry emotional significance beyond their practical function. She finds this profoundly meaningful." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself thinking about the changes that Kesara and Zarathes's presence might bring to his life. Sarah would be leaving for university next year, and he'd been dreading the prospect of an empty house above the workshop. But perhaps emptiness wasn't the only possibility. Perhaps there were other ways to build a family, other forms of connection that transcended species boundaries. "Kesara," he said as the young draconian put the finishing touches on her first human woodworking project, "how would you feel about having a regular workshop time? Maybe a few hours each week?" Her golden eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I would like that very much. Could I help with your Christmas preparations for next year?" "Absolutely. Though that means you'll need to learn about more than just woodworking. Christmas involves a whole complex of human traditions." "I am an excellent student," Kesara said with characteristic draconian confidence. Marcus laughed. "I'm sure you are." As the day wound toward evening, Marcus realized that what had begun as a simple furniture commission had evolved into something much more significant. Sometimes the most important connections formed in the most unexpected circumstances. 1 year later, Marcus stood in his expanded workshop on Christmas Eve, watching the most unusual Christmas preparation session in New Geneva Colony's history. Kesara, now fully recovered and growing rapidly through what draconians call their wisdom phase, stood at a workbench teaching a group of human children how to carve memory crystals using adapted draconian techniques. Her scales had developed the rich emerald coloration that indicated intellectual maturity, and she moved with the confident grace that had replaced the careful steps of her recovery period. "Remember," she was saying to 8-year-old Tommy Martinez, "the crystal responds to the sincerity of your intention, not the complexity of your design. Think about the person who will receive this gift and how you want them to feel." At another workbench, Marcus worked alongside Zarathes, who was applying quantum harmonic principles to traditional wooden joint construction. The result was furniture that somehow felt more solid and stable than conventional woodworking should have been able to achieve. The molecular structure of the wood aligns more efficiently when the cutting is done in harmony with the quantum resonance of the cellular matrix, Zarathustra explained, running a device that looked like a cross between a tuning fork and a scanner over a joint she'd just completed. I still don't understand the science, Marcus admitted, but the results speak for themselves. That joint will probably outlast the building. Sarah, home from her first semester at Colonial University, worked at a third station where she was teaching several young draconians the finer points of gift wrapping. The colony's small, but growing draconian population had embraced human holiday traditions with enthusiastic curiosity. The ribbon needs to be tight enough to hold, but not so tight that it damages the package, Sarah explained to Zefka, one of Cassera's newfound friends. Gift wrapping is partly functional, but mostly it's about building anticipation. Humans enjoyed delayed gratification? Zefka asked, his harmonics indicating genuine puzzlement. Sometimes the anticipation of joy is almost as good as the joy itself, Sarah replied with the confidence of someone who had grown up in a household where gift-giving was treated as an art form. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived as the evening workshops were winding down, carrying a medical bag and wearing a smile that had become familiar over the past year. She'd become something of a regular visitor to Marcus's workshop, initially for follow-up medical checks on Cassera, but increasingly for the simple pleasure of watching interspecies cooperation in action. "How's our star patient?" she asked Cassera. "Completely recovered, according to the latest genetic stability readings," Cassera replied with satisfaction. "In fact, Dr. Vasquez, I wanted to discuss something with you." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Medical concerns? Educational concerns. I have been researching human university programs. I believe I would like to study xenobiology and cross-species psychology." Marcus felt a surge of pride. Over the past year, he'd watched Cassera develop from a sick, homesick child into a confident young person with her own dreams and ambitions. "That's wonderful, Cassera," Elena said. "Have you discussed this with your mother?" "I have," Zarathustra called from her workbench. "I believe humans have an expression about young people finding their own path. Spreading your wings," Marcus suggested. "Yes, though the metaphor is somewhat inappropriate for reptilian species," Zarathustra said with the dry humor that had emerged as her personality relaxed into colonial life. As the workshop participants began cleaning up and preparing to leave, Marcus found himself reflecting on the changes the past year had brought. What had begun as a desperate Christmas Eve furniture commission had evolved into something resembling an extended family. Cassera had indeed become a regular workshop assistant, but her contributions had gone far beyond learning human techniques. She'd introduced crystalline enhancement methods that made wooden objects more durable and beautiful. Her memory crystal work had become popular throughout the colony, creating a small but thriving market for personalized emotional artifacts. Zarathustra had found work with the colony's engineering department, where her expertise in quantum harmonics had solved several long-standing technical problems. But, more importantly, she'd found a sense of belonging that had been missing since their exile from the homeworld. "Marcus," Cassera said as she finished organizing the crystal carving tools, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Last year, when you agreed to deliver the bed on Christmas Eve, why did you not simply tell Mother to return after the holiday? It would have been easier for you." Marcus considered the question seriously. Over the past year, Cassera had asked him many thoughtful questions about human behavior and motivation. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding the cultural and emotional factors that influenced human decision-making. "I suppose because I recognized something in your mother's situation that reminded me of my own experiences," Marcus said finally. "Being a single parent in an unfamiliar place, trying to do right by your child with limited resources. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up when someone needs help, even if it's inconvenient. But you gain nothing from helping us," Cassera pressed. "In draconian terms, the energy expenditure exceeded any possible benefit return. But I did gain something," Marcus said, gesturing around the workshop at the mixed group of humans and draconians cleaning up from their Christmas preparation session. I gained all of this. A community, an extended family, new friends, and new ways of thinking about craftsmanship and art. Ah, Kessera said, her harmonics indicating sudden understanding. You invested in social capital with long-term value appreciation. That's certainly one way to put it, Marcus laughed. Though I prefer to think of it as doing the right thing and being lucky enough that good things followed. As the last of the workshop participants departed, Marcus found himself alone with his original family, Sarah, who would be returning to university after the holiday, and his adopted family of Zarathes and Kessera. So, Sarah said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs Marcus had built around the workshop's central heating unit. What's the plan for tomorrow? Our first official interspecies Christmas celebration. I've been researching traditional human Christmas foods, Kessera announced. I believe I have developed acceptable draconian variations for several classic dishes. Should we be worried? Marcus asked. Crystallized fruit compote with harmonic seasoning, Kessera said proudly. And something I'm calling quantum-enhanced stuffing. Now I'm definitely worried, Sarah said, but she was smiling. Zarathes emerged from the storage area, carrying a package wrapped in what appeared to be metallic fabric that shifted colors as she moved. I have something for you, Marcus Chun. Zarathes, you don't need to heart debt, she said firmly, using the draconian concept that had become a running joke between them over the past year. Open it. Inside the wrapping was a tool that Marcus initially didn't recognize. It looked like a chisel, but the metal gleamed with an inner light that suggested advanced materials science. Harmonic cutting edge, Zarathes explained. It will cut wood as smoothly as if you were separating layers of air. But, more importantly, the tool will respond to your emotional state. The more care and intention you put into your work, the more precisely it will perform. Marcus hefted the tool, feeling its perfect balance and the way it seemed to warm to his grip. This is incredible, but it must have cost. What is the human expression? Zarathes interrupted. You cannot put a price on family. That's not actually an expression, Sarah said, but it should be. As they settled around the workshop's central area, sharing stories and making plans for Christmas Day, Marcus reflected on the strange paths that life could take. A year ago, he'd been a widowed carpenter trying to raise his daughter while building a small business on a frontier colony. Now he was part of something larger and more complex, a multicultural, multi-species extended family that somehow worked despite having no precedent in anyone's cultural traditions. Marcus, Kessera said as they prepared to close the workshop for the night, I have been thinking about next year's Christmas preparations. Oh, I believe we should organize a colony-wide celebration. Humans and draconians and the other species that have settled here. A new Geneva colony Christmas that belongs to everyone. Marcus smiled, imagining the logistics of such an endeavor. It would be complicated, certainly, but then the best things in life usually were. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea, Kessera. We'll start planning in January. Outside the workshop, snow was beginning to fall again, each flake catching the light from the colony's protective barriers. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of chosen family and the satisfaction of work well done, Marcus Chun felt that he had found something worth more than all the rare woods and precision tools in the galaxy. He had found home in all its unexpected and wonderful complexity. As they locked up the workshop and prepared to head upstairs for Sarah's traditional Christmas Eve hot chocolate, Kessera paused at the door. Marcus, there is one more human tradition I would like to understand better. What's that? The tradition of making wishes on stars, she said, looking up through the workshop skylight at the scattered points of light visible beyond the colony's protective dome. Marcus followed her gaze to the stars that had inspired his carved headboard design a year ago. What would you wish for if you made a wish? That next year will bring new families together the way this year brought us together, Kessera said with a thoughtful sincerity that had become her trademark. That there will always be carpenters willing to work late on Christmas Eve for mothers who need hope. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. I think that's a perfect wish, Kessera. As they climbed the stairs to the apartment above the shop, Marcus realized that some wishes had a way of coming true, especially when they were made by people willing to do the work of making them happen. Behind them, the workshop settled into quiet darkness, filled with the scent of wood shavings and the lingering warmth of a day spent building community, one careful joint at a time.